So welcome to episode number 15 of the Growth Ripples podcast. Today it's my pleasure to be joined by a very close friend of mine, Wim Kana. Wim, we've known each other for a very long time, I think since grade one, so about 6 years old. And you've had a really interesting career, and that's why I was really keen to get you on the podcast. So maybe if you could just spend a couple of moments just to share with people listening, your sort of journey, particularly the interesting career arc that you've had, and then maybe we can get through into a bit of a discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always a pleasure to chat with you. And, I don't think it's that common to have friendships of that duration of that percentage of one's life. So I think it's really cool that we have that. And, as life has changed, we've had the opportunity to still move with it and maintain that friendship and of course, improve it as well. So in terms of the career trajectory that I've gone through, so I completed a degree in software engineering. It was a very in-demand course at the time, and completed it. And then once I completed it, I joined a consulting company, was there for 7 years, moved into financial services for 3 years. And then at that point in time, I had a decision to make, which was to move to another country. And that country happened to be Canada. So I joined a company here in Canada, an education provider. And then pretty quickly, I joined a small company in the CRM space, so the Microsoft Dynamics space. So it was really different directions. But I think as I went through the various opportunities, I learned more and more what I enjoyed, and it was particularly environment oriented, right? So when I was in the consulting environment, it was really exciting because you got to deal with lots of different clients when I started, and then I recognized that I wanted to have the stability of a consistent environment with the same company, and I was with a financial services firm for 3 years. And then due to life circumstances, I was presented an opportunity to come to Canada and then pursue a different path slightly.
Yeah, that's quite a change from the Sydney lifestyle. And I remember we used to joke about needing your long underwear and your toques, as the Canadians would describe it. So yeah, I'm keen to explore that. But maybe even before we talk about that sort of transition into Canadian workforce, in terms of that transition around degree, because I think that's really interesting and different. Like, we had a lot of shared friends that studied software, and traditionally people go into development roles, software development roles or engineering type roles, whereas you went into consulting space. Like, what drew you to that type of work?
So I've always enjoyed technology, and I know when we were kids, all of a sudden I'd have a console that no one else had, and I know we had a lot of fun. The Dreamcast, we had a lot of fun about that, right? But I've always enjoyed technology, and I think it was just kind of the upbringing. My parents saw that it was something that was important in life anyway for us, and recognized the knack I had for technology broadly. So I went into a degree at the time in high school. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. My dad is an engineer. My mother is more on the accounting and commerce side. And so I wanted to find something in between because I really didn't know too much else. It's not like now where you've got a lot of access to information. And I think the mentoring and peer community is different to what it was for our generation, the way we were raised, and so on, right? So I went into technology. I quickly recognized that I really didn't enjoy the development side too much. I think it to me, it just created a big divide between the person I wanted to be versus the person I was while I was coding. But there was an aspect of technology that really excited me, and it's one of the main things that I stick to even to this day, and that's the impact of what technology can do in the wider scheme of things. And specifically, what I learned quickly was the way that you interact with the business, because when you have software in any way, shape, or form, it's how you utilize it to get the best for the business, right? So then I toyed with going into business analysis space or the PM space, and as opportunity would have it, I ventured more into the PM side, where it was more controlling the direction of the project and being comfortable with not knowing everything in terms of understanding how to code and so on, but knowing what it takes to get to an ideal outcome.
Yeah, I think that's a great distinction. I mean, just taking a slight step back where you talked about, like going into software. And a lot of people that I've worked with that are in that development space, they love the technology. They love coming up with great new sort of innovations or technical kind of components. Whereas what you're describing there is what I often see is quite unique in individuals that actually are more focused on, well, what's the business outcome, and then seeing technology as an enabler rather than being the focus and the endpoint. It's like, well, how can this help or hinder the outcomes of the business? And I think that's often something that's lacking, that business acumen and the commercial acumen. And it's so valuable in today's workplace. I mean, is that something that you've noticed as well across Australia and Canada in terms of what differentiates the best people in the space of IT or technology and those that maybe just sort of going through the paces?
There are several paths, right? So in terms of technology, you can go down the path of deep technical engineering and really succeed and do very well. And those are the folks that tend to rise up the ranks in software companies and places like that, right? But the thing that continues to help them rise up the ranks is understanding or accumulation of business acumen. At the end of the day, when you work for a company, whether it's technology or not, you should always be considerate of the value that you offer that company, right? How do you help drive value? And I think when I deliberately made a move to that financial services company, it was because financial services themselves are structured in a way that you're basically half technology and half business, right? Because without the technology aspect, it's not that they wield around hordes of cash and dollar notes and so on. It's all digital, right? So at that point, there was a level of respect within financial services that I appreciated, and that's why I joined a financial services company. But you still need to understand how you, on the technology side, can enable business outcomes, as you had pointed out, right? And the better you understand that, the better you communicate with leadership at various levels, at the highest level, at mid levels, because they're the folks that make the decisions around business cases to move things forward. So if you have the brightest, shiniest object and it doesn't have the utility of something else, it's not going to get the opportunity. And I think that's what I recognized early on. And I recognize that in people, particularly when I'm hiring, the understanding and connection to the business is crucial.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely resonates for me. And I guess just maybe taking us, again, just reflecting on what you're saying there, I'd imagine you're very powerful at being a great translator of sorts, because you've got that sort of technical understanding and the underpinning and foundations, but then also because you know the business and can speak sort of the language of the C-suite and the executive, you can actually sort of bring the two together, which often I find in organizations is lacking. Do you find yourself filling that role at times?
Yeah, I do. And to be honest, I think this is something that I've been fortunate to have in the current company I'm with. We have built a nature of making sure that conversation happens on a regular basis, and the conduit sits through my team as well, right? So by being able to communicate between technology and the business, and in fact, we've actually gone through the process of having the engineering team more involved in client-faced discussions, right? So you've often heard of how organizations are silo-based, and that's one thing that we try and break. Just if people can have an appreciation for other roles, it just means that they will deliver more value within their own role, right?
Yeah,
so breaking
absolutely.
down those barriers of communication.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm keen to perhaps pivot now, understand a bit about some of the differences, because there's a huge transition that you've made. You're now based in Toronto, but obviously you were based in Sydney for most of your life, certainly growing up and then your early career. So, in terms of some of those cultural elements, because a lot of people often say that Canadians are very similar to Australians in lots of ways, but having lived there for a little while and worked there myself, I noticed there's some distinct differences. You've spent a lot more time. How many years is it now? About 8 years?
It's over 8. So we came here for the birth
Fine.
of our first child, and he's now 8 and a few months. So 8.5 years. And I think
Yeah.
you were here for a year, right? Or 18
That's
months?
right. Yeah. But that's
Yeah.
back in 20, oh, I can't even remember now, 2002. So a very long time
Right.
ago. But yeah, I'd love to hear from a kind of cultural workplace perspective. Like, what are some of the big differences that you see transitioning from Sydney, Australia into Toronto and part of North America?
There's a few aspects. I mean, the first is Toronto in itself, the diversity is phenomenal. I know when I first moved here 8 years ago, there was stats, the visible minority difference, and me being a visible minority, it's something that, subconsciously I look for and consciously I look for. But when I came here, one of the things that I had understood was Toronto has 40% visible minorities versus 12% back in Sydney. So that was one thing that really stuck out to me, and I thought, okay, well that's definitely a positive. And why I believe that it's a positive is the diversity also fosters an environment of innovation and the willingness to try different things, and it's more focused on, what can we achieve out of it. And so people are outside of their comfort zones more readily because they want to accommodate the diversity, and by doing that they're forced to address it much more rapidly. So that was one of the biggest changes.
Right. It's a fascinating stat that you just shared there. Like, because we try to pride ourselves in Australia about being this multicultural country, and in some ways we are, compared to a lot of other countries. But at the same time, when you compare it to Toronto, just those stats alone, and Sydney is more multicultural than most parts of Australia, with maybe the exception of Melbourne. So yeah, it's fascinating. I didn't realize it was such a stark difference. So how do you see that playing out? It might be a bit of a sensitive topic, but as I like to sort of touch on issues that are, quite pivotal, but important and sometimes controversial. But, in terms of racism, because I think, we've had discussions about this topic before, and certainly, we saw different things at school and then growing up. In terms of the workplace, did you notice any kind of key difference between how perhaps you and others were treated in Sydney in the workplace versus Canada?
So that's an interesting question, and I think it's important to address, right? So in Australia, there were times where I would I'd look around and I'd be the only person of color in the room, right? And that is something that really stuck out to me, and it was in some aspects. It impacts confidence in those scenarios. And perhaps that's my own personal nature as well. And, as you know, I'm a very harsh judge of myself and where I go and what I do. And so I set myself a very high standard. But sometimes when you're aware of these things, it also affects the way you behave. So part of the issue could be the way I had position in my head. And the other part is there could be a nature of not understanding the diversity in itself. But you and I have had conversations outside of the workplace, and to be clear, I believe that the racism element has improved for sure, particularly in Sydney. And I as a kid, back in our elementary, or we call it elementary here in Canada, but in our public school, I think I was one of maybe 4 or 5 people that were brown in the public school. And there were times where maybe out of ignorance or just aggression, things would be said, right? And I recall the stories you shared as well about your mother and stories like that. And it's funny that I've known you for 35 plus years, and some of those stories I hadn't heard before, which is interesting. So in some ways, we also hold some of these things close because we feel that it hurts and we don't know how to communicate that, right? But even in the workplace, I recognized, and maybe I created a barrier for myself, or the barrier was there possibly, about, as you see in the ranks as they rise, right? So if you look at some of the biggest companies in the world, like the Googles and the Microsofts and so on, they're led by visible minorities. They're led by visible minorities. I don't know how common that is in Australia. I think it's changing. I believe it's changing, but I don't know. When I left, I didn't see too much of it, and here in Canada, you do see a lot of, minorities in leadership roles across financial services, across a lot of companies, across tech. And that's inspirational for someone like me as well. And in terms of what I try to do as my mission with the way I operate and work is I always try and present opportunities for people who feel that they don't have the opportunity through confidence issues. If they can deliver the work and they can excel at it, I want to give them the opportunity that I felt that maybe I didn't have.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And what it reminds me of is, that saying is it's hard to become what you don't see. And so representation is so important so that, I think it is changing to a degree in Australia, but personally, I think not fast enough. So, and there's stats around this, around diversity and inclusion and particularly leadership and the representation of non-white people. And so, we still exist, I believe, at least in Sydney and Australia, and it's great to hear in Toronto, there's obviously gone a lot further than that, but, there's still predominantly actually a minority, which is white Australians who are still leading more of companies than really the representation should be. If you look at global representation, if you look at client bases, if you look at customer bases, and it's great that some of these big companies that you mentioned, like Google, Microsoft, like you said, they have visible minority leaders who are kind of leading those companies. But I think we need more of that representation because, how are kids, your kids and anyone else's kids, unless we're seeing that on a regular basis. And it's great, having great role models in your wife and yourself, but also seeing that in the general public. I imagine that's so important, which I guess we didn't see so much also growing up back in the 80s and 90s of Sydney, Australia.
No, and we definitely didn't, right? And I think that's one of the things that I believe. I'm an optimist at heart. I believe that society is driven towards bettering themselves, and even every time I've come back to Australia, I've noticed the changes and noticed the improvements. And I agree with you. If it could be faster, it would be better. And I think we all have to use our opportunity and our space to try and help catalyze the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. What other kind of key differences have you kind of noticed? Like, I guess one thing that I'm thinking about here, and maybe just to prod you a little bit or, plant a seed is, Australians are known as like being a laid back country, pretty relaxed, but then actually a lot of the stats show that we work pretty hard, like in terms of the hours and what we do. Like, have you noticed any other key differences in terms of, work and lifestyle comparing Toronto with Sydney?
You know what? At the start, I felt that Toronto was a different pace, and I think I could probably say it still is a different pace, in that there is probably a subset of people in Sydney that are running that rat race, right? Because as the cost of living and everything goes up, Sydney is a very expensive place. Now, I've been told that Toronto was very similar, and I didn't realize that until certain positions opened up, that it was really, it is similar, right? So Toronto itself, just to give you numbers, I think is about 30 to 40% more populous than Sydney, right? The province of Ontario is 12 million versus New South Wales, I think, is about 6 or something like that.
Well, I think Sydney's about 6. So I think New South Wales is about 7 or 8 or something.
7 or 8, yeah. So Ontario back then was 12 million. And in terms of Canada's population as a whole, the similarities, I think, actually made it easier for me to move over here. So that's one thing. So being a Commonwealth country, having those aspects, there is that similarity between Canadians and Australians. And broadly, you find that, Canadians and Australians are very friendly people, right? So you can have a chat with people that you don't know and build rapport very quickly in public, right? So I think that there's that observation. But there's also the dimension of I call it the rat race element, which is trying to accumulate certain things or wealth and all of that to align with, where you think you should be in your career. And it depends on what your career is and what industry you are, but you then feel that you're surrounded by people of a similar mindset. So very driven individuals. I think particularly also in North America, we're influenced by the US, in Canada, and the US in itself is known a little bit as a workaholic nation, right? So, with the 2 weeks, they used to have 2 weeks as your vacation allowance, right? And to me, that's, you're coming from Australia where you had the 4 weeks, it was a concern, right? That said, Australians are known for, although there's a perception of laid back, you hear about them going to the UK and working incredibly hard, and there is they work hard and they play hard. I think that's probably also a really fair label to attach there too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Wim, I think we could probably spend hours talking about all this. It's been great chatting with you. And so thank you so much for being on our podcast, and hopefully I can have you joining some future episodes.
I'd love to. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you and to chat.
Thanks, mate. Chat soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, take care. Bye.